Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. The next games are versus Castlevania and Castlevania for the Play Choice 10. That's right, we've got another third-party game that was brought to both the Versus system and the Play Choice 10 by Nintendo. This is the final Versus system game we'll be looking at for a while, as by and large, Nintendo shifted their focus to the Play Choice 10. However, before we look at what sort of changes they made to these arcade ports, let's take a look at the original NES game. The original game was initially released by Konami on the Famicom Disk System in Japan in 1986. There, it was called Akumajo Dracula, which roughly translates to Demon Castle Dracula. Eventually, it was brought overseas on the NES under the name Castlevania. The development of the game was led by a guy named Hitoshi Akamatsu, who we know very little about. I could only find one interview with him that largely focused on the development of Goonies 2, a sequel to the Goonies game I covered before. However, a developer who worked alongside Akamatsu has shared information about the development of Castlevania based on conversations they had with Akamatsu. It's all secondhand information, but this is pretty much one of the only windows we have into the initial development of this franchise. Apparently, Akamatsu was inspired by a lot of films and wanted to make Castlevania a cinematic experience. The game's setting was clearly inspired by Dracula horror films, and even the decision to use a whip as the main weapon was inspired by Indiana Jones. This cinematic approach also influenced the game's notable visuals and music. After Castlevania, Akamatsu went on to create 2 sequels on the NES, although I won't be playing either of them for the challenge. Unfortunately for Akamatsu, neither of the sequels sold very well, which led to him being demoted and he left Konami soon after. Akamatsu largely seems to have left the gaming industry after he left Konami, and this early departure is likely why we don't know a whole lot about the development of these early Castlevania games. Anyway, as I said earlier, this game was eventually ported to the Versus system and the Play Choice 10, and as we can see from their flyers, they were both published and sold by Nintendo. The Play Choice 10 version was essentially the same as the NES game, as is the case with most Play Choice 10 games, but the Versus system version was another story. They ended up making the Versus system version way harder than the original, likely to try and get people to spend more quarters. If you've watched my other videos, you'll know that the Play Choice 10 had players paying to use the machine for a specific amount of time. This pay-to-keep-playing design of the machine meant that the games themselves didn't need any sort of monetization changes, and they usually remained unchanged from their NES counterparts. However, the Versus system versions of games were often reworked slightly to fit an arcade format, typically in ways to encourage players to spend more quarters. For Castlevania, the most notable of these changes were that they reduced the timer for each level, and they massively increased the amount of damage each enemy dealt. Now, Castlevania is already considered to be a bit on the tougher side, and unfortunately, the Versus system version, the harder version, ended up being the one I played first. So with that, let's jump into my time with Versus Castlevania. After starting the game, it opened with a quick cutscene of the main character walking up to a gate leading to a giant castle. That's all the game tells you here, so it looks like we're going to have to turn to the manual for some more details. The castle we saw in the opening cutscene is named Castlevania. My mission was to destroy the curse of the evil Count, and this Count has apparently been waiting for 100 years for a rematch. So that's it? No mention of the names Simon Belmont or Dracula? Well, for some reason, it didn't seem like the localizers wanted to use their actual names in the West very much. I even searched around for other pieces of Castlevania media I could find from the time, and they too were vague with the names. A lot of this was more clear in the Japanese manual, as it explicitly calls the main character Simon Belmont and the villain Dracula. Well, they call him Simon Belmondo, but that's basically his name in Japan. The Japanese manual also explains a bit more of the story. Simon Belmont is the descendant of a vampire hunter who defeated Dracula 100 years ago, which is why the English manual said that Dracula was waiting for a rematch. Dracula was apparently revived by a group of heretics on Easter Day, and it's up to Simon Belmont to stop him. Turning back to the game, I was thrown into the first stage after the brief opening cutscene. If you didn't already know, Castlevania is a side-scrolling platformer with a focus on combat. You fight with a whip, which can be upgraded by drops that come out of torches that you can hit throughout each stage. That's not the only drop that comes out of these either, as you can find money, hearts, and sub-weapons. Money just gives you extra points, and since I didn't really care about points, I typically didn't go out of my way to grab these. Hearts serve as your ammunition for weapons. That's right, hearts have nothing to do with your health, so don't make the mistake of thinking these are recovery items. Finally, sub-weapons are alternate ways to attack enemies. Typically, these will have a greater range than your whip or some kind of extra utility. You can only hold one of these at a time, and the first one I grabbed was a dagger, which lets you throw small blades at enemies in front of you. After going inside, I started running into a bunch of enemies. These first zombie dudes were pretty easy to take out, but these leopard guys were harder to avoid. Something I want to bring up here is this game's physics and controls. As I said before, this game is a platformer, so sometimes there are obstacles that require you to jump around. However, your jumping is very limited. Once you jump, you are committed completely. There's no way to move around in the air. It's not at all like Mario, which gives you the ability to change the way you move during a jump. Another kind of restrictive aspect of the controls is the way you climb stairs. You press either up or down at the ends of a staircase to climb it. You can't jump onto staircases at all, and once you are on a staircase, you can't jump off of it either. This makes stairs a far more dangerous obstacle than they might initially seem, since they greatly restrict how many options you have to avoid enemies while you climb them. Lastly, the knockback is pretty rough too. When you get hit, you get sent backwards and will fall with no control of your midair direction once again. On small platforms, this means that getting hit will often mean certain doom. Now, sometimes I hear people say that they find these controls too unforgiving and clunky, but I'll save my opinions on that topic for my review. Anyway, back to the first level. This one isn't all that difficult, but I was feeling the pain of the extra damage a bit here. Compared to the original, everyone dealt double damage, and after only 2 hits, I had already lost half of my health. However, I already knew about one of this game's secrets. You can find cooked chicken hidden in the walls. Certain blocks can be broken, and behind them you'll find an item that refills your health. The manual actually calls these items pork chops, but come on, that clearly looks like a drumstick. After navigating through a slightly more precarious section above water, I soon ran into the game's first boss, a vampire bat. At this point, I had the axe sub-weapon, which was super useful for this boss since you throw the weapon with a vertical trajectory. My health was starting to run a little low, but I was able to take him out on my first try. After this, I was taken to a screen where it showed the path I was taking through each level of the castle. The map generally follows the structures of the levels, so for this next one, I was heading up and to the left. Level 2 had a lot more platforming than the first level. It also had these new nasty enemies that were just a bunch of floating Medusa heads. These things spawn infinitely, and they float up and down across the screen. They can be tough to hit, and it's pretty easy to just get whacked by one while platforming and fall to your doom. There was one platforming section here that I kept dying to, and I eventually got my first game over. The levels in this game have checkpoints that you get taken to on death, but if you get a game over, you're taken back to the start of the stage. Honestly, this is relatively forgiving for an NES platformer from this time. On my next run through the stage, I picked up the boomerang sub-weapon, which was pretty useful since it didn't stop when it hit enemies and it could be used to hit monsters multiple times. This was called a cross in Japan, but Nintendo of America probably required it to be changed due to their no religious references policy. Anyway, past this platforming part were these nasty crushers that were ruthless if you didn't time your movements right. Also, their hitboxes were way too wide. Oh, come on, that didn't even touch me. In the crusher part, I found the best sub-weapon in the game. Holy water. Firebomb. Thanks, Nintendo of America. For this weapon, you simply throw the water onto the ground, which will cause a small fire that burns anything evil. It may not seem like much, but as we will soon see, this item is super useful against bosses. Unfortunately, I just kept getting game overs on this stage, and it was only level 2. Taking double damage from everything was just really nasty, and it was taking me a bit to get used to the controls too. However, after enough tries, I made it to the boss, Queen Medusa. I kind of got messed up by her on my first attempt, but on my second try, she got absolutely cooked by the holy water, and I crushed her. You see, the bosses in this game typically freeze whenever they are hit, and since the holy water hits multiple times, you can essentially stunlock bosses with holy water to defeat them easily. Up next was level 3, and this one was pretty tough with the extra damage too. There were a lot of new enemies that were small and hard to hit, so getting through the stage unscathed was tough. There were these small dudes called hunchbacks that jumped around, and obnoxious ravens that would fly around too. During this stage, something kind of annoying happened. After a game over, I got distracted, and since this was an arcade machine, there was a time limit to decide whether or not I wanted to continue. While I wasn't paying attention, I got booted back to the title screen. Bummer, now I had to beat levels 1 and 2 again. Eventually, I made it back, and I even got to the boss. The bosses of this stage were a couple of mummy men, and yeesh, taking extra damage from these guys made it so much harder. I died a few times to them, but finally I had a run where I was able to reach the boss with holy water in hand. The timer was starting to run a bit low, but this holy water was the trick I needed to take them out. Level 3 complete. Oh boy, up next was level 4. This one ended up being the hardest level for me in the Versus System version, although I think this was due in large part to the increased enemy damage, particularly with the boss. The level started with Simon falling deep into a cave. This section was full of water and moving platforms, and it was pretty easy to goof up and fall into the water. However, after doing it enough, this part ended up not being all that bad. The next section was just a long straight area with eagles dropping a bunch of those hunchback guys. This part wasn't too bad if I was able to stay on top of things by hitting the hunchbacks as they fell, but the moment I missed one, things would often spiral out of control. After this part was a corridor with these skeleton dragon enemies that had a ton of health. Past them was the boss, and yeesh, this one was tough in this version of the game. The manual says this duo is Frankenstein and Igor, and basically I had to hit Frankenstein a bunch while Igor jumped around shooting some kind of attack at me. The limited movement here really made it tough to dodge all of the attacks, and I would usually just get overwhelmed by them. Since this was the Versus System version, it only took 3 hits to take me out, and I just lost over and over to these guys. Finally, once again, my winning strat was to bring holy water to the fight. Often with these stages, the only holy water is at the beginning, and you lose your sub-weapon whenever you die. So both this stage and the last stage were basically just a matter of getting through the stage without dying. Using the holy water, I was able to stun Frankenstein before he walked to the point where Igor would jump off. This meant I had basically no attacks to dodge, and finally level 4 was complete. Level 5 was another stage that was pretty tough, and it was mostly just due to the enemies this time. There wasn't even a whole lot of platforming, just a bunch of enemies like these heavily armored dudes that threw axe projectiles at me. The worst room though was the room before the boss. This was a long corridor with a bunch of those armor guys and floating Medusa heads mixed together. It's a pretty nasty combo, but I was able to find a way through them with holy water. The boss of this stage was Death, the Grim Reaper. Now, I haven't talked about it yet, but this wasn't actually my first time playing this game. Well, sort of. I played the NES version before and not the Versus System version. I bring this up now because this was the boss that originally broke me. I had made it through the game without save states up until this point in my previous playthrough, but this fight made me give up and use save states. I had been wanting to get revenge on this game for a while, so it was time to finally do it legitimately. What makes this boss so tough is that he bombards you with flying scythes constantly, and it's just really hard to stay alive. However, this time I knew a secret. Holy water. Surprise, surprise. If you catch Death with some holy water as he first pops in, you can stun lock him before he even sends out any projectiles. I did that here and I crushed him. It felt good to finally beat this guy without save states. Up next was Stage 6, the final level. This one starts with a series of bridges that hang over bottomless pits, and now there are a ton of vampire bats flying around. That's right, that boss from the first stage is now a normal enemy. After challenging them a few times, I quickly found out it was just easier to run through this section. Up next, there was a nasty part inside of a clock tower with a bunch of gears. What makes this part tough though is that those eagles with hunchbacks were back, and they were so much harder to keep under control here. I died quite a bit to the hecticness of this section. To finally get through it, I used a sub-weapon I hadn't used a whole lot yet, the watch. This weapon can be used to make enemies momentarily freeze. Thankfully, it worked on the bad guys here, and I was able to get past them. After this was the final boss. In a surprising act of kindness, the devs made this room a permanent checkpoint, so getting a game over on the final boss isn't all that punishing. After climbing up some stairs and entering an ominous room with a coffin, Dracula himself appeared. This guy doesn't actually have a whole lot of variety with his attacks. He just randomly appears somewhere, waits a bit, then shoots 3 projectiles at you. There's only one way to damage this guy, hitting him in the head. Basically, what this boss comes down to is getting good at timing your jumps in a way where you can dodge his attacks and hit him in the face. For some reason though, it kind of took me an embarrassingly long time to get good at the timing here. It also didn't help that there was a chance that he would teleport on top of me, pretty much guaranteeing a hit. Eventually though, I got the hang of it and depleted all of his health. Is this it? Nope, Dracula's got a phase 2, and now he looks like a giant monster. In this form, he jumps around and occasionally shoots those 3 projectiles at you. At first, I couldn't even figure out how to hit him. I spammed holy water and swung my whip at him, but I wasn't doing any damage, and he took me out pretty quickly. Now, I ended up figuring out that the holy water was still pretty useful here, but more as a way to slow down his movements. What I actually had to do was jump up and hit him in the face with my whip again. Basically, I tried to stun lock him as much as I could with the holy water and then jump up a bunch and hit him in the face. It ended up being pretty close, but I took him out on my second encounter with phase 2. Nice. After this, the castle crumbled to bits and the game ended, showing the cast of characters. So the names here are all actually references to real life actors. I'll link a fun page I found that explains them all in the description. Oh, and here we can finally see some of the official names of the characters. It calls the Count Dracula and the main character Simon Belmondo. As I previously said, Belmondo is actually closer to his original Japanese name, but I guess the English translators eventually decided to just use Belmont instead. Anyway, with that, Versus Castlevania was complete. On to Castlevania for the Play Choice 10. As I said before, this one is essentially identical to the NES version, so this basically meant I had more time and the enemies did a whole lot less damage. So, after all my time playing a much harder version of Castlevania, this one was a cakewalk in comparison. There's not a whole lot else to say, so I'll just give a quick overview of how it went. Level 1 went down with hardly a hitch. I got hit once before the boss and took 2 points of damage. Whoa, I never even saw anything that dealt that low of damage in my previous playthrough. I didn't have the axe for the bat, which made him a bit more annoying, but I was still able to beat him with little effort. Level 2 was also a piece of cake. I didn't fall for any of the traps this time, and once again, holy water made quick work of Medusa. In level 3, I actually ran out of health, which meant I lost my holy water for the boss. This made them a bit more tough, but since I was able to take so many hits now, I still managed to pull through. Alright, time for level 4, the level I really struggled with on the Versus System version. I actually made it to the boss with holy water pretty quickly, but unfortunately, I messed up the strat and let Igor run free. I entered the battle with only half health, so I ended up dying before finishing him off. Darn. This meant that I didn't have holy water for the boss on my next attempt, but taking a bit less damage was apparently all I needed, as I was just barely able to squeeze out a victory. Unfortunately, level 5 did not go quite as well. Even though I was taking less damage, I struggled a lot more this time on the final corridor with the knights and Medusa heads. Maybe I had just grown careless with how easy everything else had been. I even got to death one time without the holy water, but I got destroyed by him. Eventually though, I reached him with holy water and he went down just as easily as before. On to the final level. I died part of the way through the stage and lost the clock, but somehow I got through the nasty clock tower section without it. Time to beat the final boss again. It still took me a few tries to relearn all the timing, but it didn't take too long for me to beat Dracula once more. With that, Castlevania for the Versus System and Castlevania for the Play Choice 10 were complete. On to the review. I think this game is pretty neat. As I said before, your controls are really limited in this game, but it's clearly by design. Games like this sit comfortably into a category I often refer to as intentionally clunky, for lack of a better term. I think these kind of games can still be fun, as long as the games are designed with clunky controls in mind, and I largely think Castlevania does a good job at this. Navigating tricky stages with difficult controls is all part of the appeal, and it provides a unique type of challenge that games with smoother controls don't quite have. It's fun to try and figure out what's the best way to approach each obstacle, and the sub-weapons provide a fun layer of variance that expands the amount of options. That all being said, I personally find that smoother platformers reach higher heights for me, so while I still did enjoy this game quite a bit, I didn't like it quite as much as some of my favorite platformers. Also, while I said I do think this game is largely designed well with its clunky controls in mind, there are still a few places where it gets more hectic than I would like, particularly with a couple of the bosses. As far as comparisons between the two versions I played, the Play Choice 10 version and by proxy the NES version is definitely superior to the Versus System versions. And no, that's not just because harder game bad, it's just clear that the NES damage values were what the game was designed around. Versus Castlevania does still sort of work as a hard mode to the original game though, and ultimately while I do prefer the original, the changes weren't enough to make me alter its score. All in all, I think Castlevania is a fun game where navigating tough stages with limited movement is all part of its appeal. I may not enjoy it quite as much as some of my favorite platformers, but it was still a pretty good time. Oh, and I didn't talk about it too much, but it also has a really good soundtrack. I gave both versions of Castlevania an 8 out of 10. With Versus Castlevania and Castlevania for the Play Choice 10 complete, I have now finished 48 out of the 51 arcade games and 64 out of the 150 NES games in the challenge. This means I am 94.12% of the way through all of the arcade games and 42.67% of the way through all of the NES games. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.